I guess we can start revising for the final exam, which is going to take place on 21st of May. Well, that's soon. And I guess that would be a better idea if we start revising from the last subject, then we go backwards. The last thing that we have visited altogether was the refugee protection, international refugee law. Well, international refugee law is also a subset of international human rights protection or international human rights law. The difference is that here vulnerability is quite high. We have started by mentioning the definitions. Do you remember who a migrant is, who an asylum seeker, and who a refugee is? I guess you have made a quiz on that. And you still have failed, some of you. But, well, I was quite forgiving. Let's start from here.
A migrant is a person who voluntarily leaves her or his country to get a better education or better job opportunity or health conditions for himself. An asylum seeker is a refugee which has not reached the final stage of its refugeeship. It's not a legal state.
Okay.
A refugee is like a citizen. It's a legal status. Refugeeship is something legal. They can start businesses or, what can I say, they can later on become a citizen of the other country. They have a final destination.
Okay. In what class are we? This is international law. Therefore, your emphasis should be always on rights and laws. Well, what are the rights of migrants? Okay, you're right actually, that those people are leaving their country on a voluntary basis for education and so on. But the most important component is missing. That was correct, but something is missing, which is
their home countries to protect their rights.
Protection, of course. They still have the protection of their home countries, of their country of origin. You can live for education, you can be living in Netherlands, you can get married in France, or you have found a job in Germany, whatever, you have left your country. And when you are there, you're still a citizen of Turkish Republic, and therefore you still enjoy the protection of Turkish Republic. How about asylum seeker and refugee? They have something in common. Yes, please. They cannot or they don't want to. So the first thing actually that you did not mention is that they have a fear. And that fear is a well-founded fear. Of what?
Persecution or discrimination.
Thank you. Of persecution. They have a well-founded fear of persecution. Therefore, then you're right. Therefore, they are somehow forced to leave their home countries. And how about, yes?
And the principle of non-refoulement is applicable to both.
That's also true. Non-refoulement is applicable on both until otherwise it's proven here that the person actually does not have a well-founded fear of persecution, but the person can be a criminal or just left their country for better economic conditions, let's say. Therefore, they don't fall under the category of asylum seekers or refugees. Then, okay, they have something in common, that they have well-founded fear and they enjoy non-refoulement and they're forced to leave their countries. Their country is either, again, what you have said is quite correct, either unable or unwilling to protect those people. Protect the rights, protect the human rights of those people. And therefore, asylum seekers leave their home country and land in a second country. Then what is the difference in between the asylum seeker and refugee once again? Actually, you have told already, and that's correct.
Refugees have found their final destination, but asylum seekers are still.
They're still seeking asylum, they're still seeking a shelter, they're still seeking a new home for themselves because they cannot go back. But they haven't found it yet. So this is a middle status. Their rights are quite limited. They have very limited rights. However, when the asylum seeker becomes a refugee, then, first of all, this is a legal status, and they have found asylum, they have found refuge, they have found a new shelter, they have a new home, and they possess refuge from one country. Let's imagine from Canada. Then their rights are under protection of Canada. This is how it works. Okay, when they find refuge, they are protected by the refuge giver state as if a citizen of that country. Do you remember the rights of refugees? The first one is non-refoulement. And what are the main features of non-refoulement? You know it, I see it in your eyes. Yes.
For example, when refugees arrive in a country, the country has to do something for them. They can send them another country, but they cannot send them back to their home country.
So they are protected under non-refoulement. My perfect usage of boards, sorry for that. Under non-refoulement, asylum seekers and refugees are protected from what? From forced return. They're protected from forced return to their home countries because that country is unable or unwilling to protect them, and persecution is awaiting them in that country. Therefore, we have non-refoulement principle. When asylum seekers arrive, they either remain there or they are resettled to a third country, but they're not sent back. How about the limits of non-refoulement? We have just mentioned it. Yes, of course, if the person is criminal or if the person does not have well-founded fear of persecution, then they're not eligible to become asylum seekers or refugees. So that's the limit. Could you follow everything until here? Do you remember the other rights of the refugees? The first one's non-reform. Second one is identity. Well, have fun with the board now. I really don't know how to continue. Identity is important because of legal personality. Don't forget this. Now, we have studied, for instance, subjects of international law. Who are the subjects of international law? They are states and international organizations. And we have mentioned how statehood is obtained. Therefore, how an entity obtains that legal personality before international law. Now, we are, as human beings, counted as natural persons. Being a legal personality, having a legal personality enables you with your right to sign papers. Can you rent a home if you don't have your identity papers with you? Can you open a bank account if you don't have? Can you enroll in any course or any university school without your identity card. So this shows that you are a registered natural person that's alive and that is able to put its signature by its consent. Therefore, having an identity is important. Having an identity is the demonstration, reflection of natural person's legal personality. Please keep this in mind as well. Natural person's legal personality is proven through their identities. Therefore, they have a right for identity. This means when a refugee is accepted, then they are given identity cards, they are registered as refugees by that country, then they can start business, they can rent an apartment, they can have a bank account, they can buy a SIM card, they can buy a plane ticket, whatever you can imagine by your legal personality is done through that identity. And at the moment, well, we have said that identity is a right of refugees. And we're in Turkey and there's a huge number of asylum seekers living in Turkey. And we know that they're not refugees. Does that mean that they don't have any identities? What has happened to Syria was a refugee influx. Suddenly they have started to enter into Turkey and that was an emergency situation and huge number of Syrians had to come to this country and they need to continue living because we never know when the situation in Syria will improve, when they are going to be able to go back to their home countries. They need education, they need to rent apartments, they need to pay their water bills, whatever. Then Turkish state is registering all those people one by one biometrically and providing them with a temporary identity for their asylum seekers in Turkey. So this is how they continue living, that's how they can enroll into schools and so on. How about the other rights of refugees? How is that? Right to family. So this indicates that refugees also enjoy social rights, civil rights. If you don't have right to family, then what you cannot do is, or you cannot get married, or you cannot bring your family to you. Once a person is accepted as a refugee by one country, let's imagine Canada has accepted, and my example, the person is a young male who was married in the country of origin, had children, fled away, and resettled in Canada. After he obtains his refugeeship by Canada, then the remaining wife and children do not apply for refugeeship once again from the very beginning because that's a long process. But they need to reunify their family. What they're doing is the wife opens a family reunification case from wherever she is actually. If she's still in Syria, from Syria. If she's in Turkey, from Turkey. And he also starts a family reunification case from Canada. Then those two cases are unified and it is controlled, of course, if those people are really married and if they really have that family. Because, you know, there are also other cases like some people are paid to get married and have a second person with them to the country that they have arrived to prevent them. Certain investigations are done. This case takes shorter time than a refugeeship application. And at the end, families are reunified as a result of this right. Any questions about family reunification, right to family? And they can get married as well. How about the fourth right? That is freedom of movement. Freedom of movement includes movement domestically and also internationally. How is that? Once a person is, our example was Canada once again, the person is settled in Toronto and the person wants to move somewhere else because of educational reasons, because of employment reasons, or whatever that is. They can change the city, or they can travel around. They can buy a plane ticket, bus ticket, train ticket, whatever necessary. They are not limited. So they are not put into cages. They are not put into camps where they are not allowed to live. Refugee ship is perhaps it's not so correct to mention it like that, but probably it makes easier for you to understand. It's kind of citizenship. Because the person enters under the protection of that state, then the person behaves as if that person is a citizen in that country, can move freely. In addition to that, moving in one country is one thing, that's domestic movement. There is also international movement. He is settled in Canada and he's looking for other job opportunities, or he just wants to travel, or he has some relatives somewhere in America, and then he is provided a passport by the refugee giving country, by Canada. Then he can ask US visa on that passport, and if it is accepted, then he can also travel to other states if visa is issued. Of course, that part is evaluated somehow else. So freedom of movement happens domestically, internationally, and they're given a passport so they can even move in between the states internationally. Any questions until here? Yes, please.
I have a question about that family.
No, just the refugee. I mean, we had one case example. That's why I have mentioned the male. Whoever, that can female, male, whoever, I mean, the sexual orientation can also be somehow else. The thing is that one person becomes a refugee and tries to bring the family with. Then the family does not make a second refugee application. Instead, they're making they don't make a refugee application, they make a family reunification application. That's how it works. Okay? Any other questions? Did we mention how UNHCR works? Okay, then let's mention that as well. Before doing so, of course, our legal sources, we have never mentioned, we have defined migrant, asylum seeker, refugee, and where do we have the definition of refugee? Where do we know about the rights of refugees? Two sources, 51 Convention and 67 Protocol are the most important sources of international refugee law. However, this law is backed by numerous other treaties, of course, under or outside UN, mainly under UN. However, those are the basics. Those have set the basic standards. And later on, other treaties were also concluded as well. And let's talk about UNHCR. What's UNHCR? United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And how's that in Turkish? Komiserliği. Birleşmiş Milletler Mülteci Yüksek Komiserliği. Okay, that's an intergovernmental organization. And this one is not a political one. This one is purely humanitarian one. And the necessity to establish such a UN body has arisen after what has happened during the Second World War, because then a huge number of people have become refugees suddenly, and in order to protect those people who are outside of the legal umbrella of their country, could be then protected by UNHCR. The main mandate of UN includes protection and promotion of human rights, besides protection or promotion of international peace and security. And settlement of disputes in a peaceful way. So UN is established actually for those three reasons. And as a result of the mandate of protecting and promoting human rights, UNHCR is also established to perform that duty. And UNHCR is there in order to deal with the most vulnerable human group that are mainly migrants, asylum seekers, refugees. So they deal with, we have said, asylum seekers. They also deal with refugees. So when people arrive in a second country, they make their application by UNHCR as asylum seekers. And if UNHCR find those people eligible, then they are resettled as refugees into new countries. This is under the work of UNHCR. What else? Have you ever heard of internally displaced people? Yes.
People displaced in their own country, so they become refugees in their own country.
Almost, that's true, that's true. Actually, we have seen something like that happening in Turkey a couple of years ago. If you remember, terrorists have nested a huge number of explosives in Diyarbakır Sur, and then Turkish security forces just wanted to enter there and do whatever is necessary. The thing is that that was also a civilian residence place, and people were asked to move outside. And then in the news, what we were seeing is that people taking their belongings with them and leaving that part. Do you remember seeing that? YouTube. Well, that has happened, for instance. They were internally displaced. And can you imagine? I mean, you're living in Ankara, you're studying here, and I'm telling you to leave Ankara as soon as possible. Then you're telling me, in a couple of weeks, we have some finals. I'm saying, no, you have to go. Then you're saying, but I'm earning my money here. No, you have to leave immediately. So this is a tragedy, actually. This is not something easy. You can still remain in Turkey, but imagine, I mean, personally, where do you go under such conditions? And how do you protect yourself? Where do you live? And how much money can you take with you? How much belongings can you take with you? So this is a huge problem. My example was a security problem. But similar cases are quite happening in Africa because of climate change, for instance. So drought is happening, for instance. Suddenly floods are happening. Typhoons are happening on those places next to the ocean. Then those people need to move as soon as possible, and they become internally displaced. Even though they're still in their countries, they need protection. Then UNHCR also provides them at least with the minimum help. What can be minimum help, by the way? What can you imagine of? What would you have provided those people with when they... Shelter, like bringing tents for them, bringing clean water for them, providing food for them. Health is important, medical help, and so on. So, UNHCR is also in charge of stateless people. As we were studying statehood, we have also visited the Yugoslavia Convention of '91, where one of the very first sentences of that convention says that states can exist and disappear. When a state disappears, what happens to your citizenship then? Or some people can lose their citizenship. So for some time, I remember Turkish politics discussing if that would be a viable option to cancel citizenship of Fethullah Gülen, because he's not returning. So should the citizenship be cancelled or what? That was discussed. And if his citizenship taken away from him, then statelessness starts. All right? So statelessness is having no citizenship. That can be happening because the state has disappeared. That can be happening because that's a punishment by the state, the regime change, whatever. There can be several reasons behind that. The thing is that if you don't have a state, then you don't have rights protection. And therefore, UNHCR is necessary to resettle those people, find refuge for those people, and provide them with at least minimum rights for their survival in dignity. And lastly, it also, UNHCR deals with returnees. Imagine being an Iranian. You have left your country in '79 after the Islamic Revolution, and you have started living in Los Angeles, that Iranians are now calling Tehran Geles, and you decide to go back to Tehran. And you're a refugee there. Under such conditions, because you're under the protection, under refugeeship protection, then your protector, first of all, wants to make sure that if you ever go back, you won't be facing any kind of persecution. Therefore, they check the conditions in your country of origin if you can really go back or what. I mean, the answer can be yes, the answer can be no, because persecution is expecting you. That's how they are dealing with returnees roughly. Any questions until here with whom UNHCR deals with? What do you think about throwing someone out of citizenship? Think legally, not politically. I mean, as a punishment. The person has to come before a judge. And then the person doesn't have the citizenship anymore. You have something to say?
Well, then it wouldn't work if that person isn't a citizen.
True.
Because then we wouldn't have grounds, for instance, to extradite Fethullah Gülen if he's not a country citizen.
True, jurisdiction rights of the state end when the person is not a citizen anymore at that point. That could be problematic. Therefore, it was a huge discussion. If it is worth it or not, if it should be done, because when it is done, I mean, your citizenship is not only your identity card. Your citizenship is also covering your rights of hair, for instance, your properties. So suddenly you're deprived of all those rights as well. So that can also be a punishment. That can also work under certain conditions. But when it comes to jurisdiction, then the person is also dropping out of the jurisdiction area of the sovereign state. Who can become a refugee is a huge question, of course. It says that those people that have a well-founded fear of persecution can become asylum seekers. The thing is that, what is fear of persecution? Homosexuals is a typical example. Well, the thing is that being homosexual alone does not mean much in terms of persecution. The type of the government, type of the regime, the approach or social standards of that state sets the basis for persecution under those conditions. I mean, in Turkey, we face a huge number of females that are running from their families. They need to escape because they used to have a relationship, and then the family finds this out, and then she's going to be killed because of that. Then she cannot remain there anymore. This is persecution. And then she's running away from the family, from the city. This is also the case for homosexuals under some societies. I mean, under certain legal systems, they cannot survive, unfortunately. And even though the laws allow them to survive, society does not let this happening. The society cannot digest. Once those people are spotted, then they cannot enjoy their right to education, for instance, anymore, because they are badly bullied, or even worse, they are harmed by their mates, schoolmates. Or the society is excluding them so badly that the person cannot find jobs anymore. So those are also persecution elements. The thing is that this needs a little bit evidence. Like if the person is spotted by the police and beaten, then the person needs medical reports that he was beaten, or some footages as other people were beating him or whatever. So somehow evidence is necessary. Genital mutilation is written here because of which geography? Africa, definitely. That's something that kind of circumference is implemented on females, and this is hurting a lot, and this is medically not approved. And under what kind of hygienic conditions it is done is another question. So many females are rejecting that happening, but once they start rejecting this, then they cannot survive that community anymore. They need to flee away. And they know that if they ever go back, they're going to face this happening to them. Therefore, they don't want to go back. So this can be assessed as fleeing away. Stowaways. If the person is spotted by the police in a train with no ticket on them, so this person is fleeing from their own country. Well, my example is train actually, but the most popular case is that when people find themselves a space in the planes where all luggages are put, so they hide themselves there and they change their countries. Actually, they are stowaways. Okay? Sometimes they don't survive this travel, of course, depending on the climate conditions. Sometimes they're unfortunately frozen. But if they survive that travel, if they can go from one country to another, and when they're landed, do they become then refugees? No? Why no? The element that you're supposed to look for is the element of persecution, not the way they are traveling. Therefore, if you come across with such a case in the exam, then your basis of analysis is always if the person's run away from persecution or what, not how they have arrived. Because that's most of the time that's the case, that asylum seekers arrive through illegal ways. And that's even perceived as normal. The thing is that their travel methods do not qualify them for being an asylum seeker or not, for being a refugee or not. The reason of fleeing qualifies them. That's important. People rescued at sea. Well, since 2015, huge number of incidents have taken place in Mediterranean and Aegean Sea. Many have drowned and some were rescued. And imagine your country rescuing those people in their own territorial waters. Then, do they qualify as refugees? What do you think? Do they qualify as asylum seekers? Why? Other views? What do you think?
Again, it depends on whether they are running away from discrimination, and in these cases, they are running from
War.
Discrimination and war.
That's true. So the question you're supposed to ask is always, what are they running away from? Are they fleeing from persecution? Not how they have traveled. Because the person just perhaps wants to reach the other country to find a better job. Looking for a better job does not qualify anyone to become an asylum seeker. Therefore, your question is always about persecution, fear of persecution. What do you think about this question? Can a woman facing attack because she refuses to comply with social constraints, can she be a refugee? Can she be an asylum seeker?
Yes.
Explain.
Facing an attack means you are discriminated because of, it says social constraints, so it depends on being a woman or a male. So it depends on something you obtained at birth, which is a basis of discrimination.
That's it. True.
So it is the case of running away from discrimination. And
Definitely.
becoming a refugee.
So that attack is the element that you're looking for. She's facing persecution. Why is she facing persecution? Because it's a female and the social constraints require that happening. Then this is a kind of discrimination. Then she qualifies to become an asylum seeker. How about war criminals? But don't tell me yes or no. Explain. If they can become a refugee, if they can ever become an asylum seeker. Yes, please.
I think they can become refugees because, again, when we trace the elements of persecution, if even we said that always even a criminal person deserves human rights protection, and if this war criminal is afraid of persecution in his or her original country because he's a war criminal, then I think there should be refugee ship provided because the element of persecution is provided and the
Then that can be the case, you think?
I think we don't see the element of innocence in any type of refugee definition. So this person does not have to be an innocent person.
I don't agree with her because I haven't heard any case. There are some countries that that penalty is legal and that penalty is obviously is not something we can connect to human rights. So,
Universal human rights,
yeah.
true. Yes.
And they cannot flee away or run away because they did something criminal.
Okay.
They're criminals, so I don't think we can call them refugee or something.
So we have two views now. One of them says that perhaps, okay, it's a war criminal, but the definition of refugee does not include innocence. And if this criminal is running away from persecution, then still can be an asylum seeker. The other view says that that's a criminal. So criminals are always given back. What do you think still? You have something to add? What do you think?
Yeah. I don't agree with her, but also doesn't agree with her because she justified his answer with the type of punishment. If the punishment violates human rights or not. She talked about death penalty and stuff. But I think the answer is no. We can't accept that person as a refugee. But the justification should not be focusing on how we punish the criminal or not. It again goes back to discrimination and judging and giving punishments to a war criminal doesn't discriminate anyone. Maybe someone speculates that discriminates based on ideological causes, but we didn't set something as such. So it is being a war criminal is not very different from being a normal, ordinary criminal. So I think this is how we should.
So we have a third view here, which is actually opposing both of the views, saying that, okay, we cannot take the punishment type as a criteria at that point. Yes?
We gave the better example last class. I mean, Greece has some of the soldiers which should be
criminal soldiers going to Greece.
yeah,
You mean that case? Okay.
We're not sending them back to Turkey back because some of the soldiers were killed in here because of what they did, and if Greece sends them back to Turkey, they fear that they're going to die too. So yeah, being a refugee does not include being innocent. I agree with that.
Okay. I have seen some other hands. Yes. Alperen, you.
Oh yeah. Like I remember the Eichmann case where Nazis were hiding in Argentina and they were abducted. But as far as I can remember, that action was considered as illegal, although the trials were later accepted as legitimate cause. Like the abduction was illegal, so.
Things are getting complicated then. Sounds correct, right?
But there was a first permission given, taken from the soldier, Nazi soldier. I mean, they show that we have a paper that he lets us to bring him to Israel for trials.
Okay.
But it was forced, but still they have
But somehow
justification in international
consent
law.
was taken. Name, that was German. Yes?
I think we have to consider who's calling this person a war criminal or not. If it's
Okay.
for instance, the ICC has tried this person, and this person is now considered a war criminal, then perhaps that person cannot qualify for refugeeship anymore. But if one country is calling that person a war criminal and the other isn't, then these definitions can change between countries.
Then the definition, where does the definition come from, can also be an element. Yes?
I agree with you. I think the repetition of the country matters in this case.
Repetition of the country, of origin of the war criminal. Okay, perhaps.
But we are not discussing, but if it was an exam question, we should take these kind of things as granted. So we shouldn't question whether United States or Ethiopia is calling some person as war criminal or ICC is doing so. We should take it as granted, being 100% sure of that person is a war criminal, and we should look at how we deal with other problems regarding refugees. We evaluate on the terms of discrimination. So what is the difference between being a war criminal or an ordinary murderer in that sense? So,
Okay.
I mean, if the only cause of being a refugee, applying for refugeeship, is you being a war criminal, then it's not enough justification for application. But if there are some other elements, and let's say there is an ongoing genocide in that country, and you are running away, but you are a war criminal. You committed that crime, say, 10 years ago, but things changed and society changed, and now there is a discrimination, then it is okay.
You're inspiring me so negatively for the exam question. If I come up with something like that. Yes, sir.
I think the reputation of the state issue is quite contradicting with the very essential elements of international law, which is the equal sovereignty of states. And I don't think that we have a right to compare the jurisdiction capacity of states according to whether the state is the United States or Ethiopia. I think it's the UN Charter Article 1 maybe that all states are equal and equal.
Law student speaking.
So,
that's
why
true.
I don't think that we can differentiate in that sense. And,
all states are equal before international law. So
it doesn't really matter who calls them war criminal. And I think I couldn't see the point why we try to avoid calling a person refugee, because it doesn't, I think, block the way to go under jurisdiction for the crime that's.
But this is the call for applying refugeeship.
you know what, you're all right and you're all missing something, therefore what you're saying is never complete. First of all, you have learned a lot of things in this class. You have learned how to define someone as an asylum seeker or a refugee. So you are looking for the element of persecution. You have learned that criminals are taken back from that non-refoulement principle. Non-refoulement does not apply on criminals. But in this class, you have also studied international protection of human rights, where you have learned that human rights are all for entire Homo sapiens, including criminals. What kind of rights criminals have? the fair trial, of course, and they have to be, prohibition of slavery, prohibition of torture, and so on. That's also applies. So here you know something, which is that the person's criminal. So according to, if that was an exam question, that's what I would have expected from you. First of all, criminals are exempted from non-refoulement principle. This is what you know. Secondly, criminals also have human rights, and we don't know if this person has that right to fair trial or not in the home country. Therefore, we cannot decide if this person still qualifies to become an asylum seeker or not, because if there is no fair trial right in the country, then probably this person is going to be kept but tried before international courts. Because war crimes are tried by international courts that you have studied under ICC and ICL, international. Okay? So, you only know a part of that, which you can use, and you're questioning the parts you don't know. If the person still has fair trial in the home country, if yes, then non-refoulement happens. The person is sent back to home country. If there's no right for a fair trial, then won't be sent back. Instead, is going to be referred to international court, the criminal court, because it's a war criminal. Yes.
Who decides that there is a fair trial in his own country or not?
Who decides if, sorry,
There is a fair trial
in a home country or not? Probably, if it's a war crime, then this person is not only war criminal. Probably there are other examples. And in order to be able to say that there are no fair trial rights in the home country, probably some precedents have taken place. There were war criminals and they're being tortured or decapitated on the streets, whatever, but not brought before judges. There's no trials, hearings. Then we can say, so precedents establish that for us.
There's no difference between normal, ordinary criminal and war criminal. The thing we just said, about fair trial, still applies to both of them, right?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yes.
I think Rudolf will want to be able to Soviet spy text by the US force.
The woman, you mean?
Sorry.
Wait, the woman you mean? I forgot her name, but no?
Rudolf will, not the red.
Okay.
In Cold War era, Rudolf will taught by the US forces by doing spying and US Law Commission decide if we send them to Soviet Russia.
Or we try on their own.
We need to do fair trial in our.
Well, you're talking about espionage, and under such cases, perhaps some extra knowledge could be extracted out of him. This could also have played a role. And one last sentence, your friend was mentioning equality of states, that's so correct, but never forget international law also requires including international politics. That's also part of the game. Thanks a lot then, see you next week.